Hi again, everyone. We're going to do a final sound check. We've had a couple more people join, so if you haven't let us know how the sound is for you, please go ahead and chat that in. If you are having any issues with the sound, you need it to be louder or it's not working quite the way you'd like it to, just click Meeting in the top left-hand corner and then click Audio Setup Wizard and follow the instructions there, and that usually takes care of about 99% of problems. Okay, looks like everybody has already responded. Again, if you haven't already downloaded the handout, you can do that on the screen there in the Files pod. And that's just one of those standard PowerPoint handouts. You'll also see the available, the full presentation is available there as well, and that will be available at the end of today's webinar as well. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Following Founders. My name is Charlie Taylor. I'm a CE consultant here at KDLA. I'll be facilitating the webinar today for our presenter, David Kirkpatrick, and I'll let him introduce himself here in just a second. A couple of announcements, a little housekeeping here at the beginning. Again, as you can see there at the bottom of the screen, if you do have any sound issues, click the Meeting button in the top left-hand corner, and then click the Audio Setup Wizard. If you have questions for David during today's presentation or any technical issues that you need to let us know about, use the chat box for that. It's in the bottom right-hand corner. And we will be sending a survey link about today's webinar. We really appreciate your feedback and need that feedback for our purposes, for funding purposes. So we appreciate just a couple of minutes on those surveys. And we'll also be sending out certificates of attendance for those of you who attended live with us today. I'm going to go ahead and change the screen over to our presentation screen. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our presenter, David.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. As Charlie said, I work here at KDLA. I've been here for 10 years. I recently became the branch manager in our local records branch. But before that, I spent most of my time working in the archives research room. So all the records that you see here today, I've had the opportunity to work with. I really enjoyed that because there is such a wealth of information that people can find in these records that are so often overlooked. So the purpose of my presentation today is actually twofold. The first thing I'd like to do is I want to highlight the collections here so that you can pass that information on to your patrons. Recommend that they come here and we'll help them in any way that we can. The second thing I want to do, and this is just because I'm a history buff, but Kentucky is turning 225, or did turn 225 this year. So as we go through these documents, I'd like to celebrate that a little bit by providing background on some of the Constitution signers. So if you have any questions at any point, if I'm going too quickly, if I'm too loud, too soft, anything like that, please let us know. And if I don't see it, they will certainly flag me down, and I'll be happy to pause and answer any questions that I can. Just out of curiosity, and feel free to use the chat box on this, has anyone done extensive genealogy? I know those questions, I used to work at a public library, those questions come in often, but I don't know how. Okay, so several people have. Good, good. Yeah, that's going to be a huge part, I would imagine, of the questions that we receive. Okay, good. Well, hopefully then this won't be too much of a review, but it'll be some new resources that you can refer your folks onto. So we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Now, in case anybody doesn't know, Kentucky's Constitution, the original one in 1792, we've had 4, of course. The original one had 45 signers, 5 from each county. And I was debating how many people we should focus on here. I'd love to have done all 45, but since it's a 7.5-hour workday and most people wouldn't stay that long, but they've limited me a little bit. So we're going to just focus on 3. And I picked people who I thought represented a variety of difficulty levels when you're doing research, excuse me, on an individual. The first name there, most people may recognize. Isaac Shelby was one of the signers of the Constitution in 1792. Kentucky's 1st and 5th governor. So that's an easy one. That's a famous individual in the state. They're not going to be too difficult to track down. The next name we see on the list is Benjamin Sebastian of Jefferson County. This is a lot more difficult because he's not well known. I doubt that many people have heard of him, but at the same time, he has a unique name. So when you're doing genealogy or historical research of any kind, anything like that that makes a person stand out is going to be an aid to you in your research. The last person, and I hesitated doing this because it is a punishing search, but George S. Smith of Fayette County. Anytime you're doing historical research, there's a good chance that at least one of the individuals you're going to be looking at is going to be a Smith or a Jones or someone like that. And it's not uncommon for people to suggest, well, that's just impossible. Well, it's not impossible if you know the resources that you're searching for. So we're going to look at each of these three individuals. We're going to examine, in that context, the kinds of records we hold here. And our goal is not just to get tombstone information. If you think about what you see in a tombstone, you get a first and last name, you get a birth date, you get a death date, you may get a spouse. But in doing historical research, we want to expand beyond that and try to fill in who these people were. We're looking for more than just a date. There we go. Now, before we move on to that, there are a couple of challenges in doing antebellum research that it's important to note. And the reason I set the date at 1850, research before 1850, was because there's a gulf here that we have to get over. There are two kinds of records that people always ask for when they come in to do research here at Libraries and Archives. They want birth and death records. That makes sense. And they want to see the census because everybody should be listed on the census. And those are good places to begin. But as the British novelist L.P. Hartley said, the past is a foreign country. They do things different there. And so the kinds of information they're recording then are not exactly what we're recording now. Before 1852, Kentucky has no birth and death records. And that's shocking to people because even before statehood, we're keeping other kinds of records that we're going to discuss here momentarily, whether it's deeds or wills, things like that. But to the people of the mid-19th century, there was no legal function for a birth or a death record. There's no Social Security. There are no programs like that that require verification. And so we don't see that kind of information. We probably would not have even had births and deaths being recorded in 1852 if the decade prior to that hadn't had a severe outbreak of cholera and diseases like that. So the counties are really trying to track what people are dying of. They're trying to track the movements of these kinds of diseases. And so that's a problem. And I know we're only going up to 1850, but just as a side note, I think it's worth jotting down. This initial birth and death law that's passed in 1852 survives for about 10 years. And the legislature repeals it because it no longer served a purpose in their mind, as hard as it is to believe. They pass a second law in 1874. That law survives for about 5 years, and then it too is repealed. Kentucky does not get its current birth and death law until 1911. So when people are doing research, not only in the antebellum period, but in the late 19th century, there are going to be huge gaps in these births and deaths that are recorded. And the other downside, even when they're being recorded, there's no punishment for not complying with the law. So just because Lewis County is keeping death records in 1874, that doesn't mean all citizens complied. And you can kind of see why they would avoid that. If you just had a baby born, you just had someone who passed away, it's 10 miles to the county seat, it's the middle of December, a lot of people simply weren't going to do that if they didn't have to. So there are some large gaps there. The other set of records people ask for, as I said, are the census record. The census is a great set of records when you're doing research. The problem is, as we see here on the screen, they change over time. So if you look at the image in the top left corner, we see a census from 1850. We get the number of household that this is in the county. We get the name of everybody living in the house. We get their ages. We get their sex. We even get the place where their parents were born. And the census changes over time. You'll see how many people can read and write, what's the last grade of school you've completed, how many years have you been married. All these kinds of records show up, or all these kinds of data sets show up on the census records. But if we look at the census in the bottom right, this is from 1840. It's a whole different ballgame. Before the 1850 census, the only thing the government is concerned about is the numbering of people so you can know who you're taxing, so you can apportion seats in Congress. So we see here only the head of the household And then everybody else living in that house is represented by tally marks. So that's a challenge. We mentioned Mr. Smith earlier, George Smith, we're going to be looking at here in a second. If you're looking at Fayette County, I guarantee you, even this early, there are multiple George Smiths. If all you have is a name, the census is not going to be terribly helpful to you. Now that image is a bit hard to see, but what it's done is it breaks the household up between male and female, and then breaks it up by ages in 5-year increments. So it's not entirely unhelpful, but it is a bit of a challenge. So when people see that, a lot of times they will get crestfallen and they'll assume that it's a lost cause, but it's not. So let's see here. What program were we using to transcribe?
For the captioning, Mark, I'm sorry. I thought it was a question for David. Okay, I'm sorry. I'll put that in the chat. I'm sorry, David.
No. All right, that's okay. Gave me a chance to get a sip of coffee. So that's the first challenge. We're going to highlight one more challenge, and then it gets better from there. I want to go over some of Kentucky's early history, because when people think of early Kentucky, that iconic image of Daniel Boone and the settlers coming through the mountains is generally what comes to mind. And it's not uncommon for researchers to come in and ask for records from Fort Boonesborough, St. Asaph's, some of these early forts and settlements in the state. So records from that period, though, are very thin on the ground. So just a quick overview to place this in context before we move forward. That first wave of hunters makes their way into Kentucky in the 1760s. Daniel Boone, Simon Kenton, Simon Girty, those folks are coming in the 60s. Again, there are not settlements here, there are not governments, and so there aren't records here that truly represent that part of the state. By the 1770s, small settlements such as Harrodsburg and Boonesborough are being created, and in 1776, Kentucky County itself is created. So before it was a state, most of what we see as Kentucky today is created, and I'll show you a map in a second of what that represented. And then 1780, that's the year you want to circle. That's when Kentucky gets its first 3 modern counties. Most of modern Kentucky fell in one of these 3 counties, Lincoln, Fayette, and Jefferson. And then in the 1780s, Kentucky begins petitioning for statehood, and we see a growth of towns and settlements. So with that in mind, this is what we're going to have for pre-statehood. The British government, and later on Virginia itself, had a neat habit of trying to keep the French and the Spanish out of anything they wanted. So what you do to do that is you say, I'm going to claim everything from here to the Mississippi River. And they would make that one big county. And then as the population increased, as folks moved westward, they would break off one county and then say everything west of this county to the Mississippi River is now this county. So the names change over time, even though there are very few settlers here. Botetourt County, as you can see on the map there, was one county that Kentucky fell into. It extended all the way from what is now western Virginia all the way to the Mississippi River. These are the kinds of records we're going to have here on that. Again, the population in this region of Virginia is extremely small at that time. Very few people are living here. There's not a lot of settlements. But there are a few records that survive. These include county order books, tithables, deeds, and marriage bonds. So one record I do want to point out here, the tithables. What is a tithable? Well, before independence, tithables, and we'll see this name continue on, are the tithe that people paid to the Church of England. It was a flat fee that people had to pay because that was the established church. When America gains independence, obviously there's no longer an established church, but that word, that title remains on records because it simply means a poll tax at that point. So it's kind of like a tax list. So they're definitely worth looking into. Fincastle County, a few years later in 1776, is created. These are the kinds of records we're going to have for them. The survey plats, I will note there, second from the bottom, looks particularly exciting. The downside to these is they are not terribly detailed. So unless you have a quilt or patchwork map that you can place this in context of, it's worth looking at, but it's not as detailed as we would see on a modern survey. That's looking more familiar. 1776 to 1780, Kentucky County is created, and I am embarrassed to say that there are no Kentucky County records in Kentucky. Anything that survives of this, that's just bits and pieces, is going to remain in Virginia. During the Revolution, much of Kentucky was evacuated due to Indian and British attacks, and many people fled eastwards. So the state almost empties out. The few records that do survive, again, are going to be in parent counties in Virginia, but they're not going to be stored here. And as I said earlier, Kentucky's big three, you can see there on the map, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Fayette. Almost every county in modern Kentucky, with the exception of the Purchase, is going to fall into that. Purchase, which are the 9 western counties west of the Tennessee River, are still Chickasaw land at this point. There's a small bit of Cherokee land not reflected on the map in southern Lincoln County called the Tellico region. But again, this is when records really begin to pick up. I will say also, we get many questions about Indian records in the state. Kentucky, the Department of Libraries and Archives anyways, has none. Most of Kentucky's Indian tribes begin moving westward very early on. And of course, Indians are sovereign. They're not part of the American nation at this point. So they're not going to be participating in the kinds of records that a local official is going to retain or write down. Another question we often get from researchers is about the Trail of Tears. And that happens in the 1830s as a result of Andrew Jackson's removal policy of Indians moving folks from the southeast into Oklahoma and those regions. Kentucky was not part of that. By the time the Trail of Tears was instituted, Kentucky's organized Indian tribes have already left the state. There are some people residing in Kentucky with Native American heritage, but again, there were no organized removals from Kentucky. It's worth noting the removal route did pass through western Kentucky, but again, no records were going to be generated from that because there were no organized Indian tribes in Kentucky that were moving west. So people ask about the Dawes rolls and other rolls from the various Indian tribes that moved. Again, those are not going to include Kentucky. So if anyone asks for that, it's unfortunate that we don't have records on it, but that's a pretty simple question to answer because the answer is no. So that gets us up to 1792 almost. Kentucky holds its first convention in 1784. It ends up holding 9 more conventions before statehood is actually realized. And that meant that Kentucky, instead of being the 14th state, ended up being the 15th state behind Vermont, even though we should have been the 14th. Not that I'm bitter. I'm just saying that's how it worked out. So Kentucky achieved statehood in 1792. And that's what the map would have looked like at that point. So if you're looking for a county record for modern-day Lewis County, again, you're going to want to look in the Mason County records for that period. Kentucky ends up with 120 counties. We almost had 122. That's a separate story. But again, people living in these areas often ask the question, I'm looking for somebody in modern-day Washington County, but Washington County didn't exist at that time. Were those records transferred to Washington County when it was created? And the answer is no. Whatever the county was at the time the record was written down, that's where it's going to remain. And that brings us up to the 3 founders we're going to talk about today. I thought we'd start with the hardest first. We might as well go ahead and plow straight into it. And again, what our goal here is to fill in what we know about this person, something beyond just a date. Looking at the Constitution, we realize this gentleman is from Fayette County. We know that his middle initial is S, and we're going to go from there. The first set of records we're going to start with are probably a collection that most people consider the most unexciting. They're extremely valuable, and these are the tax assessments. As I'm sure nobody will be surprised about, the state has always been very thorough at collecting taxes. And so these records, with a few exceptions, are going to exist even before statehood into the 1780s. And I will say this, most of the records we're going to talk about from here on, even though Kentucky doesn't become a state until 1792, because we start seeing our modern counties created in the 80s, these records are going to stretch back to that point. So that's worth noting. We see here George Smith does show up on the tax list. The value here is with these shifting boundary lines. You can locate the person you're looking for. You can often see when they make their entrance into the state. Virginia issues a lot of free land to soldiers who fought in the Revolution. And so if you're trying to ascertain when your settler comes west, when your ancestor comes west, or the subject of your research, the first year they show up on these tax assessments will provide you with that information. Now, early on, they're not giving us a lot of information. We see livestock listed. We're going to see members of the household sometimes listed, number of slaves, that kind of information is going to be listed here on the tax list. That's about all we're getting. But it is at least placing our research subject in the county, and it gives us a hard date on where to begin. I wish I had an easy answer for that question. Many people, and we've experienced this a lot here, the question is, how do we convince folks doing genealogy that we just don't have the records? And it's often a difficult task because it's easy to assume that people have always had the same needs, the same desire to keep records that we do. And trying to put modern 21st century Americans in the mindset of someone from that era is very tricky. It often involves explaining the reasoning why, and it's simply because, just like us today, you're only going to keep a record if you have a reason for it. If there was no purpose for it, they're simply going to throw it away. And a lot of times people can relate to that reasoning, and that will often placate people. But it's hard to imagine today. Why would you not want to keep a birth record? As many things as we use them for, why would you not record that? But in the minds of people in that period, a lot of denominations have baptism records, christening records. That information is going to be recorded there. Even if you didn't, you probably stuck it in the family Bible. And even if you missed a date, the value there is simply not there. So there's no easy answer to that. I wish I had one. But just explain to people that, just like today, individuals are only going to use their time and their resources on recording things they think are valuable. And that's part of the challenge that we have to come up with, or that we have to grapple with. As I said, the past is a different place. People are thinking differently. So it is a challenge. That's a very good question. And I'll add to that, too. We've had people, even after explaining for 10 and 15 minutes why the records don't exist, have said, well, I'll just go somewhere else and I'll find them there. Well, they're certainly welcome to try that. We always encourage research, but, it's not always possible. So, and this second tax list here, and again, more questions, follow-up questions, feel free to add them. Again, they'll flag me down again, and I'll interrupt at any time, but I'll roll forward here. Trying to tell them that the courthouse burned. Oh, that's another big issue. And that the library wasn't there many years ago, but that doesn't work. Yes, and then, have them search the parent county. That's always an option. And sometimes there are non-government entities that are helpful too. Not all cemeteries, but some are going to keep rosters of tombstones that go back quite a ways. The Kentucky Historical Society has non-government records, so they have family surname files. They have a cemetery roster where they've had people go out and do grave rubbings. That's not the whole state, but it's pretty extensive. So those are always options as well. Sometimes if you can refer somebody to another option, even if it's not 100% likely they're going to find what they want, just to have another option is going to be of value. And who knows? I mean, there is information in those records, and oftentimes it'll surprise you what they find. So that's very true. So we see George Smith here showing up, and he gets his iconic S. So there's probably someone else in the county at that point named George Smith that we're looking at here. And as we pass through the years on these tax assessments, it's tedious work, but you can follow an individual forward through these tax records. Again, the absence of death records. If you don't know when a person passed away, you have a decade span. The year they stop showing up on the tax list is going to be the year they either moved or they passed away. So again, these tax records are valuable in that sense. That first one there, you can see how they evolve also, is from 1792. That third one, and I apologize, these came off microfilm. The headings are not always clear, but I'll talk about those momentarily. The third one is from 1797. That is a key year because we see a piece of information show up that's not there before, that sounds terribly boring, but is incredibly useful. Does anybody know what the fourth column over is? It says clear. That is the watercourse that the property borders on. Most of these people are agricultural in nature. You need some kind of watercourse. And that's going to be valuable as far as placing where an individual lives. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. We also see George Smith has 3 entries. He's got 300 acres, he's got 100 acres, he's got 400 acres. this is going to be useful as well because many of these early settlers are going to have multiple land holdings. And we see over beside Clear Creek and Stoner Creek in that column there, we see the county where the land falls. Now, that's kind of hard to read. It says ditto, but it's just referring you up to the previous list or the previous listing. So it's Fayette County, right? His first two pieces of land, parcels of land, are in Fayette County. The third parcel is in Bourbon County. So again, these tax records, now we're getting a more defined area because as large as those early counties are, unlike today, you really need something to help narrow it down even further. These water courses are going to be extremely useful when it comes to that. And remember, Clear Creek, we're going to come back to that in just a second. Quiz question. Next collection of records we see here, deeds. Now these are very useful, but they're not useful for the reason that people think they are in the 19th century. When many people come in and they ask specifically for a deed, what they're typically asking is, I want to find the family farm. I want to see where great-great-grandpa lived. I want to see the property that he owned. This will get you in the general region. But if you read through the description here of the property boundaries, you're going to see 15 poles down to the two large ash trees in the corner, up to the large rock on the west side of John Smith's land. John Smith doesn't live there anymore, and I would almost be willing to bet that those trees and that rock are no longer there. So if you're attempting to locate a piece of property specifically with a deed, these early 19th century deeds are not going to be as helpful as they are in the modern era. But what they do provide us with, we see here. This is mentioning the parties involved in the deed, and we see here it says, witnesseth that the said George Stovall Smith and Frances his wife, born in consideration of the sum of, and it gives the price of the land. First we get George's middle name. Now I will admit, that's pretty rare. It's a bonus, but when you're looking for George Smith, any kind of identifying information you can find like that is going to be valuable. You don't often see middle names in a deed. But hey, that's why it's worth checking. The real value of this comes from the naming of his wife. We see Frances listed there. As you all know, in the 19th century, women are often not described as prominently. It's difficult finding them listed there. And so if you're doing research, especially on a spouse, the deeds are a great place to begin. In Virginia, which Kentucky was a part of, before 1786, a wife was entitled to a dower, or basically a third of her husband's estate when he passed away, so she would have something to live on. Again, that law goes away in the 80s before statehood, but that tradition remains in Kentucky. So on all of these early 19th century deeds, you're going to see the wife listed. So when you're doing research, especially if it's a common name, this is an exceedingly valuable tool that you're going to want to use. And you don't see it listed here. George has already been living here for a while. But when you're tracking someone across state lines in this period, that's not easy either. But a deed always says the residence of the person purchasing the property. So it might say, it doesn't in this case, George was already living there, but it would not be unheard of for it to say George Stovall Smith and Frances his wife of the county of Brown in the state of Ohio, or the county of Fincastle in the state of Virginia. So this often helps people connect their research subject from where they're living now to where they were before. The tricky part about that is many people came to Kentucky as laborers, and we don't think of it that way. We like to think of the independent settler who comes in and claims his land and all that. Many people come in as laborers, though. They're going to be working for somebody else, so they're already residing in the county by the time they actually purchase property. So sometimes that gets in the way, but it is a very handy tool to check if you're trying to either find the name of a spouse or connect people to the state they were in, or even the county they were in before. All right, I need to hurry then. That's good to know. Half hour in. Order books. Nobody thinks of poor order books, but they are a wealth of information. Order books contain any decisions made by the county court. So this is going to include the appointment of guardians at this period. If parents die in a cholera epidemic or something like that, you're going to see the children being awarded in many cases to a family member or someone in the community. You're going to see the appointment and the payment of local officials. So if you had an ancestor who was a sheriff or some local official like that, you're going to see them listed there. The appointment of executors to settle someone's estate. If you die without a will, the county still has to settle your estate in some way. This is where you're going to find those people appointed. Now, you may not care who settled the estate of your research subject or your ancestor, but occasionally it's useful because it's often relatives, it's often friends of the family. It may be, the wife's or the family or the in-laws. So if you're trying to find a wife's maiden name, this may give a clue to that. But it's especially useful if you don't have a death date and you don't have any other reference. You know they've disappeared from the tax list. You know they've either died or you know they've moved. You're not sure which one. If you can find an appointment of executors in these order books, you're going to be able to confirm that, yes, someone did pass away. In this, we see George is getting paid to actually help take care of road work. So it's a big deal. Somebody has to clear the roads. Somebody has to fill in potholes. Somebody has to go out after a storm and make sure that everything is passable. And rather than have a full-time employee that did that, counties simply hired someone locally who they thought was trustworthy, who could be appointed to go out and maintain the roads. So this tells us George is a respected member of the community. Let me know if I get talking too fast also, because I'm running out of time and I've got a lot to say, so I'm going to speed up. But again, I definitely don't want to get to the point where people can understand what I'm saying. Court records. We often suggest these to customers, and occasionally we'll get the person who looks at us aghast and says, my ancestor wasn't a bad person. We're not saying they're a bad person. We're just saying in this early time, there's no way for people to entertain themselves, so they took each other to court a lot. And the real reason for that is survey techniques are very poor in the early 18th century, in the late 18th century. Boundaries are often a bit ambiguous. That causes court issues. And again, Virginia has no money to pay settlers following the Revolution. Their answer was to give lots and lots of land away in Kentucky. So they would give somebody a blank check worth 500 acres, 200 acres, 1,000 acres, depending on your rank, send you westward. You had to find that land, make your way in and report it. And so there are often overlapping boundaries here. So again, court records are extremely valuable. There's a wealth of these. We see here George Smith is having an issue with his neighbors, William Blair and William Arrear, and things are not going well. We see a description of the property over here. Those postage stamp surveys, again, not terribly useful, but it does give us a water course, and it fills in some information on the subject that we're researching. A quick note on Kentucky records is that the current circuit court system is created in 1803. So you're not going to find a circuit court case before 1803. What you do find in 1792, Kentucky creates 3 courts. They have the Court of Quarter Sessions, which handles civil cases. The Court of Oyer and Terminer, which is classic Anglo-American tradition. We took a French term and just slaughtered it. Oyer, O-Y-E-R, and Terminer, T-E-R-M-I-N-E-R. That was created in 1792, and a Court of Appeals was created. Oyer and Terminer handled criminal cases, Court of Quarter Sessions handled civil cases, and Court of Appeals, of course, was any case that was appealed up. In 1795, Oyer and Terminer goes away, and Kentucky gets a general court. And the general court, we'll talk about more in just a moment, is an upper-level court that handled big cases that involved a lot of wealth or a lot of land, and occasionally you could see a court case from Court of Quarter Sessions transferred up to the general court. So again, just a side note, these are often stored together, but it's worth keeping in mind that from 1792, if you're looking for your ancestor being sued or suing someone else, from 1792 to 1803, it's the Court of Quarter Sessions, not the circuit court like we think of today. All right. Now, George isn't always on the offensive in some of these cases. We see poor George is suffering a bit here because this actually is not a case over land. If you read the description about midway down the page there, this is a case of slander. James H. Stewart is issuing a plea of trespass, not that he trespassed on his land, but that he's broken the law, in the case of slander, and he's asking for a considerable sum of money from poor George. So I don't know what George said. I tried to find the rest of the case. The details don't survive. But we do know that George was having a bit of trouble with some neighbors. And we see on the back here that this action, it says for slander, um, was executed. So they did find George. They did take him to court. He did get his subpoena. He showed up. He testified. So, again, these are colorful details about an individual if you're doing a family history, if you're doing research on somebody, that are valuable. Well, we started talking about George with one of the only two things that we're certain of in life, and that's taxes. Now we're going to do the other, and that's death. George should have a will. People often say, researchers will often say, well, my ancestor was poor. They were just a poor farmer. They wouldn't have had a will. That was something for rich people. That's not necessarily true. A lot of people do not have wills. That's certainly a fact. But many, many people do want to see their estate settled when they pass on. Just like today, people are concerned about what happens to their children. They're concerned about what happens to their spouses. So even if there's not a will, there often is, but even if there's not, we should at least see the county trying to settle a person's estate. So I'll pull up my will index here. I'm going to find George S. Smith. And again, the D.O., of course, is just for ditto. So these are all Smiths. I see George, George K., and then Gertie. We've got an issue. Where's George? Well, we have to think back to what we talked about earlier. Everybody remember when we looked at the tax record, we saw Clear Creek? That's the clue we're looking for. There's no will filed for George in Fayette County. What happened? Well, looking at how Fayette County was laid out up through 1799, we see that actually it had shrank quite a bit from where it was in 1780. But it still includes Jessamine County. And if you see what we've marked on the map, Clear Creek kind of winds its way in through Jessamine County and stops there. If George had property on Clear Creek, there's a good bet that he actually passed away in what is modern-day Jessamine County. And sure enough, when we pull up the index for Jessamine County wills, we see it laid out there. We see this general index here that George has a will. We also see an appraisement of his estate. He obviously asked for some things to be sold off to settle his debts. That's a common practice. And we see what should be a settlement. You also see here there are bills of sale that can be included. Some people have them, some people don't. And there are settlements that are completed by the county if someone didn't have a will. Here's a copy of George's will. Again, I apologize for the quality. This came off very, very old microfilm. We see he is George Stovall Smith. He did pass away in Jessamine County. And the great thing about wills, not only do they give us a death date, but they usually name the children. I got a little worried when I pulled George's will because early on in the will he says, to my wife and my children, and he leaves it there. But we do see it broken down later on. George mentions that he has older children and he has younger children. He often names several of them. We see a Philip, we see a George Jr., we see a Thomas. So we're going to remember them because they're going to come back up. So we have a lot of examples here of members of George's family. And if we're tracking someone forward, the names of those children are going to be extremely important. George's will, by the way, was almost 10 pages. Usually they're 1 or 2 pages. I didn't put all 10 on here, but because he was wealthy, we see that. And the great thing about wills and also inventories, which you now see on your screen there on the right, is we're at the mercy of the person doing the inventory or the person writing the will, but you're going to see a varying amount of detail. So just to let you know how it should work, once a person has a will, the county goes in and makes sure that will is executed. If they have a will, they've appointed somebody or the county's appointed someone, and oftentimes they will inventory everything a person owns and they'll have a sale if the money is to be divided among the heirs or if it's to pay off a debt. We see everything here from mares and the color of the horses they own. You'll get down to the number of 10 cups he had. Sometimes it will just say books. Sometimes it gives you the title of the books they're reading. And that's extremely interesting if you're doing research on someone. There's a book out called In Search of Hannah Crafts. And Hannah Craft was a slave who escaped to the North. And she wrote one of the first fictional novels by African American. And they were curious. It's so well written, and it seems to follow trends of the day and how fictional stories were written. And their question was, how did she have this knowledge? How did she know about the style and the way to write? And going back, they know she had been given permission by her owners to read in her spare time, which was extremely rare for a slave to have that ability. But she had access to a library, and when they found a list of books owned by the slave owner, they saw several fictional novels that mirrored her style of writing. So this gave historians a lot of insight into her world before she escaped and obtained her freedom. Speaking of African American history, it's certainly a sad feature, but a very useful one for African American researchers. Inventories and wills often include the names of slaves. The tax list, as we said, are going to give you the number of slaves, but we actually get names here of individuals, and occasionally ages, although those are more rare. But again, a great resource for not only researchers who are looking for someone who's passed away, but someone doing slave research. Alrighty, back to the circuit court cases that we talked about earlier. Just wanted to go over these momentarily. Again, this is after 1803. We see George S. Smith and Thomas Smith listed here. Now, I will say we know George has died, right? So this is George Jr. These are his two sons. We've leaped forward a generation. And there's a bit of a problem. Members of the militia could be asked to help collect taxes in the Antebellum era. And the militia is one of the few things that bound the community together. Not much survives in the way of militia records for peacetime. The War of 1812, things like that are a different story we'll talk about in a minute. But everybody had to be in the militia unless you were in a select number of professions. If you were a minister, you certainly didn't have to. If you were a professor at a college, you didn't have to. But everybody else is going to be serving in the militia from a certain age. We see here that George S. was a collector of fees from the county. I guess he's helping the sheriff here collect debts that are owed. And he didn't quite follow through with his duties because George S. in the 9th Regiment was meant to collect fines from George S. Smith. He's not going to collect a fine from himself. So they're taking him to court because he owes a sum of money. So again, one more way that court records can connect one generation to another and provide details. Because now we know, even if we didn't have the will that listed Thomas and George Jr. as siblings, now we know they are because of that court case. So never overlook the value of court cases. Now, during my research, back to African American research for a brief aside, I was searching obviously for George Smith, and I came across a Smith that wasn't who I was looking for, but I did want to include this document because it's extremely valuable. Court records are a great place for antebellum African American research. Slaves are often in court or the subject of court cases. And this is a very sad story, but extremely useful for researchers. This narrative here talks about a slave who somebody had said something to him or somebody was being mean to him, and the shackles he was wearing on his wrist he used as a weapon to defend himself. So, yes, a very sad story, but for researchers, African American genealogy or African American history for this period, these early court cases are not to be overlooked. And there's just mentioning the name of the owner, and it gives us some context there. Bonds are an example. There are a lot of things that a person had to do in early 19th century America in part of their community. We like to think of them as men of their word, who a handshake was all you needed. And that was true in a lot of cases. But a lot of things still got written down. So if you were going to open a certain business like a tavern or an inn, if you were the only inn in the county, the government doesn't want you charging people 8 times the going rate because they have nowhere else to stay. So the state government actually regulated what you could charge a person for a room, what you could charge to provide for their horse, what you could charge them for a meal. And they even break it down some points to hot meal versus cold meal. So if you had an ancestor who was something outside of being a farmer, whether it was a physician or a sheriff or a county clerk of some sort, these bonds are certainly worth looking at. All right, I'm going to skip forward a bit because I know I'm running out of time. Benjamin Sebastian, the next guy we're going to talk about. All of the records groups I mentioned for George, you can find on Benjamin as well. We're not going to rehash those, though, since we've already talked about them. He did have a land case that lasted quite a while. Or, I'm sorry, that was George Smith had a land case that went on for 30 years. So it was file after file of records, so it was very valuable. But moving on to Benjamin, I'll tell you, just for context, he was from Fairfax County, Virginia. He lives in Jefferson County in 1792. He's signing the Constitution as a resident of that county. And he faces a lot of the same problems as George. We see here is a court case from the general court, which I mentioned earlier. And the problem is Benjamin's property butts up against Squire Boone. We've all heard of Squire. And, I wouldn't mess with the Boones personally. They seem like pretty tough folks. Apparently, Sebastian does try, and he's complaining to the court that he's been ran off his land and he can't go back. So, again, interesting information there. But outside of just owning land and being a farmer, Sebastian has a lot of other skills that he puts in place here. We see Benjamin Sebastian is listed here as one of the founders of the city of Louisville in Jefferson County. So that's certainly worth looking at. The acts of the General Assembly are laws that are passed, obviously, by the legislator. They're codified into a volume at the end of that term of court. But we see things in here outside of just laws. We see the appointments of officials, as we see here. If someone wants to put a mill on a river, you had to have permission from the legislator. We're going to see that listed there. And we're going to see, move forward here, divorces. It sounds odd to us, but before 1850, any divorce requested had to be approved by the legislator's Committee on Religion. So before you could take your case to court at the county level, you needed to have approval or just cause issued by the legislator. So we see an example of that here. We're also going to see an example of other things the county or the state may have made a decision on. If someone is abandoned and the county is trying to help them out, we're going to see that listed here as well. Sometimes you'll see taxes deferred on. We're going to talk about the War of 1812 in a minute, but one gentleman who went off to fight in the Battle of New Orleans was supposed to update his land grant. He had to make certain improvements in order to keep the land. He argues to the legislator, hey, I was away fighting at New Orleans for American independence, so they give him an extension. So again, the acts of the General Assembly are very complete. They exist for every year, and they're worth looking at. But in addition to that, we also see here that Benjamin Sebastian is appointed to the Court of Appeals. He's a justice for the Court of Appeals. I'll bounce forward quickly so I don't run out of time. He runs into a problem, though. I don't know if it was his last name, which is very Spanish, or what tipped people off. But there was a movement to actually break Kentucky away from the United States in the 1790s and ally it with Spain, which owned what we think of as the Louisiana Territory that hadn't been bought yet. Benjamin Sebastian, a lot of people thought this was a good idea. You've got to get your crops to market. You've got to take them through New Orleans. If the Spanish control the Mississippi River, maybe it makes more sense for us to be allied with the Spanish than does the Americans. As you can imagine, the federal government doesn't take kindly to people trying to snap off huge chunks of the country and form their own nation. So there was an investigation. Several people were arrested. Benjamin was never discovered. We see later, though, in the House and Senate journals, which exist for each house of the legislator, an investigation is launched against Judge Benjamin Sebastian. And they find out that despite his protestations of innocence, he had been receiving a very large pension from the Spanish government, which was kind of the straw there. So he ends up having to resign. They determine that no further investigation is necessary. And we see in the governor's executive journal here, that he resigns, and we see the governor appointing his replacement. Certain appointments, whether it's to the militia, if you're a commissioned officer, so you're above the rank of sergeant, if you're appointed to a government spot such as sheriff or court of appeals, the governor had to appoint you, even though there are elections for some of those offices. The governor's journals exist here at KDLA on microfilm and in their original format. These are a great place to look for those kinds of appointments. Oh, and they're also online. Thank you, Jennifer. They're also online through the e-archives, so worth checking there too on our website. We see here another familiar name in Kentucky. He's being appointed to the militia, Henry Clay. All right, moving very quickly. There are a number of census records that are worth noting in your research and for your customers. We often think of just the enumeration census, which lists people, and as we said, that's not extremely useful in the time period we're in unless you're looking for a head of household. But there are a number of smaller non-enumeration schedules worth looking at. For example, in 1820, the government wants to know what kind of industry exists in the state. And we see here on the bottom of this page, Benjamin Sebastian owns a water mill, a grist mill on Rough Creek, which is west of Litchfield. Now, he's still saying he's in Jefferson County at this point, but we know Litchfield is in modern-day Grayson County, so that's worth keeping in mind. We see here it even tells us that he can make 20 barrels of flour on demand, and so he's doing pretty good. By 1850, this kind of census record is much more detailed. We're going to get what the business is, what resources they're using, how much they're using, what they're producing. We here at KDLA have this for 50 and I think for 60 as well in the research room. The same thing exists for the agricultural census. Unfortunately, we don't have this back to 1820, but we do for 1850 and 60. We're going to see everything from the number of bushels of apples a farmer can bring in, to the number of cows they own, to the number of hands they hire to help with the harvest. So again, for filling in details on a county, extremely valuable. In 1850, the government took a mortality census. This is simply a census of people who died the previous year in the last 12 months. It's very narrow, so if you don't have someone who died in that time frame, it's not terribly useful. But it is valuable if you do, because it acts almost like a death certificate. We're going to get their occupation. We're going to get, I think, what they died of. We're going to get their age. We're going to get their sex. We're going to get their race. All this is listed here. So again, extremely valuable, and it is statewide. Lastly, there are slave census records for 1850 and 60. These are valuable. They are tricky to work with to some degree because you only get the name of the slave owner. You don't get the name of the slave. You get their age. You get their sex. That's useful to some degree. So if you had found a slave mentioned in a will and you were trying to figure out what happened to them, you could look up at the slave owner and see if they owned someone in that period that matched the right age and the right sex. Or if you have a name of a slave, you know they were enslaved before the Civil War, you're not sure whose slave they were. Looking at this, if you have an age, this will at least help you narrow it down to a short list of people. So again, bridging that gap between the Antebellum Era and the post-Civil War era is difficult sometimes, and this is a tool that can do it. So back to Benjamin. He has that mill, right? We want to find the mill. Well, he said it was 20 miles west of Litchfield. So, we draw our line there. And west is a relative term, right? It doesn't mean 100% west. It could be anywhere along that arc that I've marked with stars there. But if we're looking at this map, we want to find the perfect place. And again, that's 20 miles as the crow flies. So if he's on some curvy back road, it may not be quite that far. He eats up some of that distance as he's traveling. So if we're looking for a place for a mill, exactly, it would be near water. Very good. The water I'm seeing on here the most, we see up around the Falls of Rough. So if we looked up the Falls of Rough, we get this description. And we see, starting on the end of the third line there, it was developed around the Green Mill, built in 1823, on a site purchased from Judge Benjamin Sebastian. So we know that the mill, or at least maybe his mill is not there, but at least this was the site of his mill, and that it still exists today. So you can look it up on Google Maps, and we get a connection there to the past that we normally wouldn't find. So it takes a little bit of detective work, but okay. All right. Lastly, we have Isaac Shelby, first and fifth governor of Kentucky, a man who is fearless on every account. So just a few other minor things I want to mention here. Governor's papers exist. These are not typically useful for genealogy research on just an average citizen. Every now and then they are. We mention the executive journals for appointments to the militia and local offices. That's certainly true. But again, they're worth noting that they exist because you never know what will come up. So we see here a petition for pardon, and this is probably what touches the common man the most. Just like today, you could ask for a pardon from the governor from day one. And these are fascinating to read. Obviously, as we get closer to the modern era, they exist in more abundance and more detail, but they contain a lot of information. For example here, let me make sure which example I'm on here. Oh, yes. This poor gentleman is protesting that his friend was arrested. His friend, Mr. Perkins, was having a discussion with a fellow member of the community, and just to read off here, it says he happened to be in the town of Princeton together, and an altercation took place between them of some warmth and continued for some length of time. And Mr. Perkins, having a cane in his hand with which he was gesticulating, suffered it, in the heat of the controversy, to fall upon the lapel of Mr. Boyd's coat, without any intention of committing a battery upon him. So he was just aggravated. He tapped him with his cane, and the other guy fell down and claimed that he was attacked. And he goes on to say, this isn't the kind of person you're trying to arrest. You're trying to look for violent criminals, and just because he hit another man with a cane doesn't make him that. So, again, a small collection, but extremely valuable insight on the community. And people often find their ancestors in here, because not only are you going to find the person writing the petition, he collects signatures from other people in the community that attest that the gentleman he's talking about is an upright citizen. Now, this is just one more, just for fun here, but you get to see the language of the time as well, and how interesting people are, and how this poor unbiased soul is writing. He says that we know him, the subject of the pardon, or the gentleman making the accusation, to be a turbulent and quarrelsome man, and we know that Benjamin Baker also has lived all his life near him, and he bears the character of a peaceable and orderly citizen. So again, he's arguing that his friend, Mr. Baker, should be released. So again, a valuable collection a lot of people don't think about. Military records are something we're often asked about. And we have Adjutant General Sam Hill to thank for what I'm about to tell you. Yes, there really was a man named Sam Hill, first of all. But following the Civil War, a shameless plug for the archives here, there is no archives to store records in. Hill is the Adjutant General. He needs to find a place to store all the records he's going to begin receiving and has received for the Civil War, a massive conflict. In his mind, soldiers who had fought in the War of 1812, who had fought in the Mexican War, most of them were elderly now. They did not need their service records. So his solution was to burn them all. And now he has lots of space. While that did work for him to some degree, it left us with a huge gap in military records. So I will go ahead and say, if you're looking for a military record in the antebellum period for a time of peace, when there's not a conflict going on, you're not going to find it. If you're looking for someone who was in the War of 1812 or the Mexican War, you're going to find the Adjutant General's report. And these are useful as well. They're going to give you the name of the soldier. They're going to give you the name of the militia unit they were in. They're going to give you when they mustered in, and you might see a detailed killed in action or wounded at this battle. So again, they're valuable. They're not as detailed as we would like them to be, and they're certainly not as detailed as what we see for the Civil War. We see here, since we're talking about Governor Shelby, we talked about pardons he had received. He was in the war, actually led American troops in battle. Hard to imagine, but he marched to Canada, dismounted, and got his rifle and got in line. So it's hard to imagine a modern governor going to Iraq or Afghanistan alongside the National Guard and fighting. Left the Secretary of State in charge of Kentucky. He was sure would be fine. He said, "I'll be right back." And sure enough, he was. So, a different time, no doubt. But we see William Dudley listed here. And beneath him, we see James Shelby. This is Isaac's son. We know from doing research on the kinds of records we've already mentioned. So, we're seeing Shelby's son listed there. If we're trying to find out if this is the right James Shelby, though, Shelby's a common surname, maybe not as much as Smith, but we have to try to figure out where that James was from. In the Civil War records that researchers are looking at, it's going to tell you where they mustered into the service at. So you can kind of get them down. If you know your soldier was from Pike County and this guy is mustering in Paducah, that's not the person you're looking for. We don't have that luxury in the War of 1812. So what we have to do is look at a book called the Cornstalk Militia. It's going to give you the appointment date of officers in the militia. And we see that James, who was a major, before that he was a captain, we can see what county he was appointed from and figure out that is indeed Shelby's son. So, also, each county had its own militia regiment. And again, I apologize, I'm moving very quickly here so I don't keep anybody. So, if you hear that somebody is in the 8th Infantry or the 8th Kentucky Militia, we could look at this map and tell that was Fayette County during this period. Again, these boundary lines change all the time as the population grows. But at least for the War of 1812, if you have a number, we can narrow down to where they were from. Many of these units that marched north to fight in the War of 1812 are only named for the commander of the regiment, so usually the colonel. So you'll see Dudley's men or Taylor's men or something like that. but we can often find our way back using these two volumes that I've mentioned. So again, Adjutant General's Report and the Cornstalk Militia. KDLA has a collection of rejected pensions for military service. Now, I think many of the websites, Ancestry may have them, several other websites are going to have pensions for military service, a military pension for service in the Revolution War of 1812. We don't have those here. They're available in so many other places. But we have a small collection of rejected pensions. These are valuable because a person may have to submit an application more than once if the government didn't feel that they proved their service. If you said you fought in Virginia, that may not be enough to satisfy them, so you may have to submit it again. We see details about a person's family here, including their spouses and things like that. And marriage records I didn't mention earlier, but here's an example of Shelby's daughter getting married. According to one of Shelby's biographies, he received a letter from the prospective groom asking for permission to court his daughter and hid the letter. Again, that's in his biography. Don't know how true that is. He didn't want to lose his youngest daughter. She discovered the letter, though, and probably the only battle that Shelby ever lost. But she does get married. So quick note on those. That was a marriage bond. You often don't see parents listed on those until later, much, much later in the 19th century. But they are often helpful. You're going to get the name of the bride, the name of the groom, and you're going to get the minister and whoever helped pay for the bond. So it cost a lot of money to get a marriage bond back in the day. Oftentimes, these were a family friend, or the bride's father, but not always that way. All right, quick question here. At what point did the state legislature stop taking up considerations as a request for divorce? In 1850, Kentucky gets a new constitution. So from 1850 on, you just want to look in the circuit court as we would today. That's a good question. Before 1850, there'll still be circuit court records. It's still worth checking there, but you'll also see them listed in the legislature. No problem. So this is a brief overview of the questions that we've talked about, or the kinds of records we've talked about so far. Here's my contact information. I know it went terribly fast, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to contact me, or you can also call the research room here at KDLA, and they can answer any questions you have. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much to David. My mind is blown by that. So I wanted to remind everyone that this was recorded. So if you're like me and you might want to go back and review anything that he said, that will be posted within about a week on our archive webinars page. This webinar was made possible in part by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And you can come back and check this out later, but some more of our webinars coming up over the next few weeks. Please check our CE events calendar to register for those. Not too late to register for one tomorrow. And just wanted to give you some links to the library development links for on certification, our CE events calendar, and our social media. And on the right, you can also see that the Archives and Records Management is extremely active on social media. So there's many places for you to check them out and see what they're up to, of which David is a part. Thank you again to David for being our presenter. Yay! It was excellent, fascinating. And you can see in the bottom left-hand corner in the files pod, the link that says founding. It says founding fathers, but that's my mistake. I kept getting it confused. But the 7 megabyte is the one that's the full presentation, the full slides. So you will have that information to refer back to as well. Thank you all for joining us today. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with David. And you can just click the X in the top right-hand corner when you're ready to exit.